And we were going to start by lighting the chalice. And I have a little tiny chalice that's beaded, that was done by a member of our congregation who currently lives in Houston. And it's now lit. And our chalice lighting words are written by Reverend John Lou Johnstone. We shall overcome. When we can truly celebrate the diversity of contributions and talents offered by all people, we shall overcome hatred and prejudice and oppression. When we can truly extend our hands to one another in loving acceptance, we shall overcome the past that haunts us now. Living in peace and freedom, we shall overcome the wrongs that have happened and the debts left unpaid. Let us join together in that commitment to overcome. Let us say together, Amen.
Amen.
This session will be recorded and it will be posted to the UUCA YouTube channel. If you would like not to be part of the recording, please use the chat for your questions or comments, and the facilitators will read them anonymously. And you can start the recording, Cindy. This is the second session in exploring privilege and power, using our power to create change and combat racism. We're going to be discussing how to use our power and privilege to counteract and dismantle systemic racism. And wherever you are in your anti-racist journey, this session will create space for you to explore and apply these concepts in fresh, dynamic, and powerful ways. Kristen, Morrow, and Kyle Megrath, who presented the first class in this session, which was last Tuesday, are with us again for this session. Both of them have been very actively involved with Atlanta Standing Up for Racial Justice. Kyle began his journey as a trainer and facilitator when he was an in-home family therapist, developing new clinicians to better understand trauma-informed care, cultural humility, and mental health advocacy in Boston and Brooklyn. In 2012, Kyle worked on the marriage equality campaign in his home state of Maine, winning there before going on to win in Rhode Island and Indiana. It was during this time that Kyle was fortunate enough to be mentored and invested in as a trainer, a facilitator, an educator, going on to design and provide learning opportunities in healthcare, education, for-profit and non-profit institutions with a liberation, equity, and anti-racism lens. Kristen is a member of North Avenue Presbyterian Church and will become an active deacon this year. At NAPC, she has been involved in racial reconciliation groups for the past few years. She has a bachelor's degree and a PhD in the biological sciences. Her passions lie with social justice for marginalized and excluded people, including exclusion based on race, ethnicity, mental health issues, homelessness, and so forth. At Surge, she helped lead and organize the study group on prison abolition. I now turn it over to Kristen and Kyle.
Awesome. Thanks, June, and thanks all UUCA folks and ARE for kind of inviting us into and sharing this space with you. Feel really lucky to be here. And we're going to jump right in because we have amazing stuff to go over with you today. Last week, we really tried to define some terms with you so we could just get real grounded in what is systemic racism, how does it show up, and today is all about confronting it and using tactics and strategy to really address it. I'm really proud to be doing this with Kristen too, and grateful for you. The goal of today is really to understand how we can be strategic and tactical in addressing systemic racism, which is no easy feat, as many of you probably know already. So to get us started, just like we did last time, I want to make sure we check in around accessibility. So in the chat, you can direct message Kristen or I, or we welcome like public statements of need, but just let us know what you need tonight to fully plug in. That might range from talking slower to don't judge me if I have to get up and take a walk or stretch my legs. It really, anything. It just helps Kristen and I know how we can support you and fully plugging in. And while you might be thinking about that or typing something in, we just want to give some quick framing concepts to help you understand how we approach the privilege and responsibility of doing this training, particularly as white folks. So one is that we're standing on the shoulder. This content is not ours. We are representing and repurposing content predominantly made by Black and brown people, and we want to honor and cherish that. We know and we approach this work in understanding that why we gather and why we show up is because if we dismantle racism, if we dismantle capitalism and patriarchy, we all get free, we all benefit from that. And that's how we approach this work. We also lead with race. While of course we're invested in dismantling patriarchy and capitalism, we lead with race because fundamentally it's the biggest and most massive point of oppression in American society and really globally. And we understand intersectionality as well, that people's intersecting identities can be multiple intersecting identities of oppression. And we want to focus our intervention and our work where people are oppressed the most. So that would be thinking about queer and trans, Black and brown, women of color, non-binary people of color, that and disabled folks. We want to focus on the intersections. That's where oppression is the biggest and where our work can have the biggest impact. We also don't believe that we are your teacher tonight. We are a facilitator of a conversation. Yes, we're going to deliver content. We're going to rely on your beauty and brilliance to lift it up and raise it up and let us and teach each other. So that's how we approach this work. And Kristen's going to do a land acknowledgement with us.
Yeah, so I just want to acknowledge that if you're in the Atlanta area, you're on Muskogee Creek land. This land was taken forcibly from the Creeks. They're exiled out of their land. It was taken. It hasn't been returned. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And I'm going to pass it back to Kyle.
So we just want to do some agreements like we did last time. There are so many more agreements we could lean into, but we're here together. We've got you for a little bit, so we're hoping we can commit collectively to this. So we want to take space and make space. So if you're someone who doesn't typically share a lot, we hope you can find a way tonight to jump in, chat in the group, just share some of your wisdom and thoughts with us. And if you're someone who shares a lot, we hope you can be aware of that and make space for other people. If you find yourself participating multiple times in a short period of time, we ask you to make space for others. We want you to lean into your discomfort. We're going to be talking about strategies today to dismantle racism, and that is like often involves risk and effort and work. So we hope you think about that and honor that. Grace and generosity. So we're here to listen and grow and know that people might slip up and make mistakes. As a white person, I know I do that on the reg. We're going to provide grace and generosity, but there's also no reward. So if you're coming on here to tell us how many books you've read and how woke you are and how many protests you've been to, we're not here to be there. We're not here. That's not what this space is about. There are so many things we could talk about tonight. And there's so many opportunities, but tonight we're going to focus on what Kristen and I kind of built and be graceful with you if things go in a different direction, but we are going to try and bring us back and interrupt attempts to derail. If you have any particular issues with that, go ahead and put in the chat and we will try and honor that as best we can. All right, so for this next part, we're going to do an activity, and thanks again to our Zoom tech, Cindy, for helping us out. But in a few minutes, we're going to break out into groups of 3, 4, maybe 2, who knows? It'll be a surprise. But generally, what we're hoping you can do is spend some time with this quote, which from Lila Watson, that says, if you've come here, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. Oops, what's that?
We can't see your screen.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I just realized that you meant to should be showing.
Oh, I haven't been sharing my screen this whole time?
No.
Oh my goodness.
It's okay.
Well, here it comes.
But I figured for the quote, it was important.
It is important. Sorry about that, y'all. Okay. How's that? All right. Welcome to the slides that Chris and I worked so hard on and are now just lost to the winds of the internet. Okay, so if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up. And if Kristen, you can drop this link in the chat, that would be amazing. This is a document we're going to reference a couple times today. And the quote is in here, so you'll be able to reference it. And don't worry if you can't get it or Google Docs isn't your jam, that's okay. Hopefully someone in your group can get to it. But you can see the quote here. And as a group, you can answer one prompt, both prompts, whichever you want. But the two prompts we're hope you'll have about 10 minutes to discuss is, what is your stake in dismantling a racist, capitalist, and patriarchal system? In other words, how are you not free until everyone is free? So as a white cisgender guy, I might say patriarchy doesn't do me any favor. It does me a lot of favors, but it impacts my life. It prevents me from being vulnerable. It prevents me from having deeper relationships with people. Being white makes me think I need to be perfect all the time and has made me think that my identity is just neutral, when really I have an ethnic identity extending into Wales and England and Italy. So thinking about what's your stake in dismantling racism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, and capitalism. And then if you have some time, just kind of really diving into this quote. What do you think Lila, who's a Murray, which is an indigenous Australian person, why do you think she prefers you operate from a place of your liberation being tied with hers, rather than operating from a place where the reason we do this work, the reason we come together, the reason we show up to a Black Lives Matter protest is because it's community service and we're there to help Black people? So just think about the difference between those two. And thanks, we're ready to break out. Cindy?
Okay.
Welcome back, y'all. Hope you got a chance to talk about your stake. So I would love if a couple people were willing to share back what they said, not necessarily what their whole group talked about, but just kind of what they said, and welcome a person or two to do that. That would be great.
Well, I'll go ahead and share just to get us started, not because it's a lot of wisdom. But you know, the first thing when we started talking about my liberation tied up in you know, getting through like the patriarchy and capitalism, it just spoke to me so much of our UU principles of the worth and dignity of every person. And unless I can feel like we're all on an equal playing field and it doesn't feel so disproportionate, there's not a peace in my being. And so that's where I see the liberation coming from.
Oh God, thank you, Barbara. Yes, that is it. Is one other person willing to share out?
I'll talk. One of the people in my group mentioned the fact that you end up getting a lot of the best ideas when you have you know, multiple perspectives to anything, and that's actually been proven. You know, like that's actually part of like business school. It's also part of you know, in the business world, they have found that that's actually the best way to get the best ideas. And by not being inclusive, you know, a lot of times the best ideas do not come out. They're not the you know, the revolutionary ones because of that.
Thank you, Rita. All right, I hope that helped folks kind of warm up. I'm grateful for whatever you shared and all the conversations we didn't get to see. but just as a means of saying, hey, we're here to talk about dismantling systemic racism, and guess who that benefits? That benefits you and me and like all of us. Our world is better when we do that. So let's go ahead, and Kristen's gonna talk about local political involvement.
Yeah, I thought it would be good to start here just because I feel like when you talk about activism or politics and how you can kind of change what's happening in society, big problems or small, we immediately jump to, you know, the federal level, like call your senators, petition the president, like just really, really, really high up people, instead of thinking like what issues are actually also dealt with on a local level. So the first thing I just want to start out with is city councils. So each city has a council for the most part. I think some states in like their constitutions can probably have exceptions. They kind of structure it. But at least for Georgia, each city has a council. So I have a little screenshot of the Atlanta City Council website, and you can see here that there's sections to find out who your council members are, sections to find their legislation, their standing committees, and then how to get more involved. So they have multiple committees and commissions that are separated based on subject. So depending on what you're interested in, you're knowledgeable about, and or passionate about, you can learn more about what they're doing, give them feedback on those topics. And then the general council meetings are open to the public. And as a member of the public, if you're a resident, you're able to submit questions and comments. So if they're weighing a proposal that you really support or really oppose, it's a good idea to attend and to submit a comment ahead of time to let them know what you think, because your voice really can carry a lot of weight. And part of the reason is because these meetings are not highly attended. So chances are, like, unless it's something that has already galvanized a lot of press attention, you know, there might only be 3 or 4 just public citizens there. So I just want to go through and give, using Atlanta as an example, the power kind of that city councils have. So something that happened in August of last year is that the city council passed restrictions on the use of police force, which was a good thing. This was in response to the events of last summer. Then more recently this year, the Atlanta police chief briefed the council on their car chase policy. So there's been some controversy about when car chases are initiated, the risk to the general public, that kind of a thing. And they actually took a public comment from someone who had been pretty seriously injured as a bystander as the result of a car chase. So testimonies like that can be very powerful in these sorts of things. And this is an article actually from Teen Vogue, but I thought it was interesting that they used Atlanta as an example of how city councils have power over sort of immigrant rights. So here they were able to terminate sort of the role of ICE in detaining immigrants here. So the mayor issued an executive order declaring that our city jail will no longer detain anyone for ICE. Oftentimes, in addition to the mayor's office, that comes from city council members and county commissioners. And then as a bigger picture, cities have quite a bit of money at their disposal to use. So in May of last year, they approved $1.5 million to help shelter the homeless during the outbreak. So they have a lot of resources that they can use to help the public. So I briefly mentioned commissioners when mentioning that article on ICE. Commissioners are at the county level. So like I live in Fulton County and I just pulled examples from Fulton, but this is true regardless of what county you live in. Their meetings are also open to the public and you're also able to submit comments, questions, concerns. They also have boards that are established by the commissioners, and then the commissioners go to members of those boards for input. So you can see on the bottom right, like there's an animal welfare hearing board. There's an Airport West Community Improvement District. Like there's a ton of different boards and authorities that exist that kind of depend on neighborhood, and then just special topics like animal welfare, healthcare, justice, that kind of a thing. And I also want to say at the county level, there's other decision makers. So there's other boards and departments. So like there's the Department of Education, there's an elections department, and then health and public health. So you can see in Fulton County, at least, our county is the one that's in charge of figuring out the distribution of the COVID vaccine, which is very important. And there's also independently elected officials like the sheriff and the treasurer. The sheriff's office is fairly independent of the county, but obviously they work closely together, and then they work with the cities within the county. So with the city of Atlanta, especially. So just going into things that the county has control over, obviously they have control over a lot, and they have even more financial resources than an individual city because they are kind of helping the cities with funding and partnering on different projects. So something that was very, very recent, just 2 days ago, is that the Fulton County Schools, so all the districts in Fulton, they're going to allow courses in Black history and women's studies. I think they're just testing it out in a few schools, but they're actually working to try and make sure that the education that students receive is more representational of, you know, the lived experience of people in Atlanta in general in the past, as well as for all the African American, Hispanic, Native American people that live here, because those subjects are so neglected normally in school. And then I already said this, but Fulton is providing the vaccine for residents. They're organizing all of that. And then the new Fulton sheriff has announced that he wants the county to buy Atlanta's jail. Obviously, he doesn't have like solo ability to do that, but his opinion matters a lot. And then obviously at the county level, you have early voting initiatives. So basically the number of polling locations, mobile voting, voting by mail, the counties help ensure that all of that happens. So you can basically think of counties providing just sort of the structural resources necessary for like healthcare, for voting, for education, for all sorts of things. And then I thought this was interesting. This was in the middle of last year. The Fulton Board of Commissioners actually killed a $23 million jail expansion project. So that's like a huge thing for them to do. And that was directly as a result of activists and people sort of writing in with their opinions, saying that, you know, they didn't support this happening. It was more of a will of the people than, you know, the commission just deciding on its own, as are most of these issues. So the moral of the story, if you haven't already guessed, is that local politics matter. Local politicians have more power than we think because a lot of the issues that we're facing have policies that are at the very local level, either city, county, state, and especially for education and policing, a lot of the policies or funding for these resources come from the local level. So city police departments, county sheriff, that kind of a thing. And obviously I want to acknowledge that the federal or state level legislation from those quarters is more helpful. It's stymied quite a bit by just both political parties arguing back and forth. And it's really hard to pass bills in that kind of environment. So change ends up being very slow. And then another benefit of local politics is that your voice counts more because a lot of people just don't end up going to these meetings or reaching out to the politicians. So I just want to give a brief recent example of how local politics can shape an issue. So I'm sure most of you are aware that street racing is a major problem in Atlanta and a lot of other major cities. Complaints from residents and even from the police brought the issue before Atlanta City Council. The council sought feedback from residents on eliminating cash bail for street racers. So what happened? Residents who supported the elimination of cash bail called in to give their opinion in much larger numbers. The council ended up suspending cash bail in response to these calls. So now street racers and suspected street racers who are overwhelmingly Black no longer receive the benefits of the bail reform measures that were enacted several years ago. So this is just an example of, I think total there was only 500 calls and maybe 240 people called in support and like 200 called in against it. So all of those together were what the council used to weigh their decision, and just a tiny difference with a fraction, like 50 people, can make a huge difference in the outcome that affects a whole bunch of people. So I think that transitions well into what Kyle is about to talk to. He's going to talk about sort of organizing on a larger level, so more like as a group, as an organization, that kind of a thing. And I'll hand it over to him.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. And yeah, that definitely makes me think too about how laws that pass in cities often grow into counties and grow into state and then grow into federal. We think about some of our most progressive laws being something that was done first in Portland, Oregon, or Atlanta, or, that often is how things go. And it's just really powerful to think about how our cities and the people we elect in cities can be the movement towards something better. All right, so I am like fully cognizant that you're not going to absorb all of this, and that is okay. We can make these slides available. So I'm going to go through some of this strategy and tactics stuff a little quickly, mostly because this isn't rocket science. Most of it is something you could Google online and get a really good tool on how to plan a campaign. But generally, I'm going to go over 5 really key steps for how you would really plan and implement a strategy to create social change, political change, any way that you want to confront a system that is oppressing people. These are 5 steps on how you can do it. So we're going to start with number 1, which is a community needs assessment and thinking about consent. So for this, the important thing to keep in mind is that, and often white people, like white people do this especially well, is like think that something's important and then get after it without necessarily figuring out like, okay, who else is doing this work? Is it as important as I feel like it is according to the community, particularly, again, thinking about intersectionality, like, is this what queer and trans Black people think is important? Maybe I should rethink if I think this is the most important way to spend my time. So you want to know what the needs of the community are before you go on. And if you are going to do something as a faith community, as a small group of people, you want to make sure that the folks impact, like if you wanted to do something about street racing and getting rid of cash bail, you might want to like figure out who's organizing in the street racing world. And have that dialogue before you start like getting all these calls into legislators or something. So you want to know where's the info, don't act alone. It's a fine balance sometimes between not burdening a community with your questions and your let's have a roundtable discussion and actually trying to get community consent. So again, you just do the best you can. Always, in part of not acting alone is finding solidarity with other groups, faith groups, political activists, other organizing homes, and build a coalition of like-minded folks to do the work. So you're not kind of acting alone, you're not recreating the wheel. That's always the first step. The caveat I'm going to throw in here, particularly as I think communities that are largely white folks, is sometimes the community assessment's been done and we just need to follow the lead. We need to hear what folks need, and then we need to like be accountable to what we're asked to do. So sometimes that community consent and that community assessment is done, and then the result of it is like going to the UUCA or going to showing up for racial justice and saying, hey, can you show up for us? The next step is to deepen understanding. So you might have data, you might have information, you might have done some interviews, but now you need to really deepen your understanding. And that really is about a bunch of things. One is, you can do things like attend community meetings. You can kind of just get a better sense of local context that's going to help you understand this issue more deeply. And then it's good on you to do political education on historical context. So if you were doing something like street racing, you might think about the history of policing in Atlanta. And it's not something you need to read every textbook about, but you don't want to like enter into that organizing space without having done some of the work. And you want to make sure you're finding ways to support POC-led infrastructure. So taking the lead from folks of color, again, particularly folks at the margins who are thinking about that work as well. All right, so we've got community assessment and consent. Then we're going to even go further and deepen our understanding of the issue so we can move on to step 3, where we develop and clarify our goals. So that's really part of clarifying your goals is the obvious, but it's also about, you want to make sure that part and parcel of your entire goal setting strategy is that your goal should always be to build community and as part of your work. So you're never not building relationships. You're never not strengthening relationships. You're always approaching this work from the place of we're stronger and better when our relationships are powerful and durable. And then you also want to implement some kind of infrastructure to be accountable to your values and to the people leading the movement. So oftentimes people wander astray when they're not accountable. So you have to have infrastructure for holding people accountable. We could do 10 trainings just on that, which maybe we should do sometime. You want to create a set of agreements like Kristen and I did early on to kind of help govern yourself. And it was frustrating. I wanted to like present a few tools to help people create goals, but there are a million ways, a million tools that are already made for you to create goals. That could be, some folks know of SMART goals or SMARTY goals. There are so many tools to create goals. So the internet's got your back on that one. All right. So step 4 is you want to really implement strategies for actions. So the only question you're asking yourself is, how are we actually going to meet these objectives? We want to close the Atlanta City Detention Center. Okay, that's our objective. And maybe we have some sub-objectives. How are we going to do it? So that's who, what, where, when, why, or not why, but who, what, when, where. And that's how you know you're kind of got your strategies in place. And I'm not going to go over this whole slide. It's very overwhelming. I'm going to share it with you. But the good news is people have been thinking about political activism since the dawn of organized society. So there is a huge range of tactics you can use to create political and social change. The place I really want to draw your attention to is actually at the bottom of this, which don't worry, I know it's so small, you probably can't read it. So the items on the left of your screen, the strategies on the left, those are less risky and involve more people. So when we think about bus boycotts during the sort of that era of civil rights, that was effective because it involved so many people. And yes, it was risky, but it's much more risky for one person to boycott the bus. Like that's not going to be effective and could be more risky. But if hundreds and hundreds of people boycott the buses, that's going to make that an impactful strategy. Now, the further you get to the right, it's more risk, but involves fewer people. So when you think about direct action, which might be, going to Mayor Lance Bottom's office and handcuffing yourself to one of your comrades and sitting there until they get rid of streetcar racing bail, then that would be effective because it's risky and because you can get media attention, even if 5 people do that. So that's all I want you to be thinking about. I know in your brains, there are a gajillion strategies that aren't even on here. So don't worry too much about memorizing this, and we'll share slides, so don't worry. Okay, next is like a big step, the last step, which is you want to mobilize. So that means putting your plan into action. But of course, that's not enough. You need to evaluate as you go, and you need to figure out how you're going to sustain your people. So those are the 5 steps I would, and now I'm going to move into some of the pitfalls of what often happens when people try and start the work in this way. So one is what I'm going to just generally lump as, like, generally this is where I think white folks, everyone, but particularly white folks, have a hard time, which is skipping steps or getting out in front of it or saying we don't need a community assessment, but just kind of running through things too fast. Sometimes having a savior complex, which is, you know, we're going to do this for someone. This is a need we're going to do. Sometimes it means you have a great idea, but you're just kind of stewing on it. This is what's happening with reparations right now in our country. It's just like how many committees and people need to get together before we figure out that, like, Black and brown people have been disenfranchised and need money. Like, it's not complicated. And so oftentimes government and people will just analyze something to death. And when this stuff happens, often it means that the people most impacted by these kinds of laws and our social society are harmed. So one way you can address this pitfall is commit to the plan and your values and accountability. And thanks for bearing with us. We're going to do an activity in just a minute. So next is, like I said, all of your basis, and at every point you should be developing deep and sustainable relationships. So if a movement is built with superficial relationships and low accountability, then it's going to fall apart. This is what happens all the time. So you want to make sure that you're centering relationships and that you create structures for accountability. That might mean you have a group of people that regularly are checking in with other people and saying, hey, like, how are we doing with our values? How are we doing with our mission and our goals? Is someone harming our community or another community? How can we support them and help them be accountable to what we're doing? That's all what accountability is about. Okay, so next is skills, knowledge, and analysis gaps. This is when you're bringing folks in and maybe not training them, bringing them up to speed, not supporting them so they can be active participants. So you want to make sure you have a good infrastructure for onboarding and giving people opportunities to learn and learn knowledge and skills. Another pitfall is basically capitalism, but rigid hierarchical gatekeeping leadership. So these are when you have leaders who are holding on to leadership where they're rigid in who's allowed to be a leader, and that oftentimes they prevent progress from happening by gatekeeping and saying, no, we need to wait, we can't do that, that's not how things work, in a problematic way. So you want to create a leader-full movement. That means that there's opportunity for leadership everywhere and everywhere, and that you provide opportunities for people to grow and learn. So another pitfall is that, you know, naturally people are going to harm one another and be in conflict. It happens. So you want to make sure you're committing, and this is a whole other training we could do, but to transformative justice and community support and accountability. What I mean by that is that you want to make sure if someone or some group or multiple people are harming one another or there's conflict in your group, that you have a way of addressing it that supports folks. So in the chat, or if someone wants to share, what pitfalls did we miss? What are some things that movements, political activists, social activists, like, what are other ways that people mess up? What did I miss? Did I get everything? Maybe I did. I'll take it. I'll take it. That's all right. We're going to have a group kind of thinking about pitfalls a little bit more deeply. I think this is you, Kristen.
Yeah. Someone pointed out in the chat that one of them is listening to others, like people failing to listen to others.
Love it.
And
Thank
something
you.
I was thinking of was like burnout, like people not really being sustainable.
That is always such a huge problem, especially when it's like a finite, or like a presidential election. When you know, people stop. Self-care isn't always like the thing that people characterize, but then people are so burned out that when maybe a runoff is happening, it's like, where to, you know. So definitely keep that in mind for sure. Great point.
Okay, so I'm sharing the Google Doc again because our activities in that, I moved it up to the first 2 pages, and I'll just briefly read the activity. So this is just a scenario where, like, just pretend that you were sort of asked to do this. The Atlanta City Detention Center is still not closed despite promises from elected officials. Fulton County's Sheriff Labatt recently announced that he wants to buy the mostly empty jail from the city and keep it open as a county jail. Mary Norwood, the chair of the Buckhead Council of Neighborhoods, is mobilizing Buckhead residents to support efforts to keep the jail open. Black-led organizations need your help to close the jail and convert the building into a center for equity that supports the community. So we're kind of asking you to think about what you would do in the situation, and we're going to have 3 different groups consider this, and Kyle is going to go into what each group is going to talk about.
So the idea here is that the community assessment is done. ACDC's got to close. They need our help. So our goal is clear. It's like, we got to close this jail or prevent it from our council members from like altering course from what they committed to do. All right, so I'm going to go through our different groups and then ask if anyone has questions. I want to make sure you feel clear going into your group. And then we'll break you up in a good way. So group 1 is strategy. So, and you can see, and thanks Kristen for doing this, but here is, in the same document, is the list of all the different strategies. You can use that, or maybe you think of your own strategy. Maybe you're gonna like drop a banner on the, I'm not from Georgia, a highway that's everyone else drives on. Or maybe you're going to disrupt a sports event or something. So you tell us what strategy you want to use, group 1. Group 2, okay, so our mission, we got to get these council members, we got to raise awareness, we got to make sure we're closing the show, we got to get people on board. What are some pitfalls that you can anticipate? Maybe you pick 3, 2, 1, whatever. And how would you address them? So you might say, we're worried not enough people know that this is happening. And that's a pitfall, right? Public awareness is like a huge pitfall. So how are you going to increase public awareness? So group 3, don't worry about that one. That's Kristen and me. We got you. Okay, so group 4 is going to be political education and skill. So just kind of thinking about what skills do people need? What political education might people need to be effective organizers in closing the jail? And then if someone came to your group and was like, I'm invested, I'm interested, how would you bring them on board? What education or skills? You can answer all of those or one of those. It's all good. All right, friends. Questions, comments, concerns? No? So we're gonna break up in a second, but just make sure that one person from your group, maybe 2, if you're really doing that collaboration stuff, is ready to kind of present back some ideas of what you talked about. So maybe you're taking a couple notes, generally informal. Thank you.
Go.
All good. Kristen, anything else?
Okay, here.
You want to run us? Sorry, definitely going to hear some dogs in this house. Kristen, you want to do the debrief? I forgot what we'd said about this.
Sure, I'm happy to. Is anybody from group 1, which is strategy? Does anybody from the strategy group want to talk about what they discussed?
Yeah, I can go ahead. So we decided we needed a lot more information about this, what the detention center is, what it would be used for, who the policymakers were at play, what the Center for Equity is, and so on and so forth. So we wanted to do a lot of educating, figuring out who the actors were, what the issues are, how we can help. And since we had mentioned, or since the scenario mentions that there were some black-led organizations already in play here, we thought possibly some of the legwork was already been done, and perhaps they have something very specific that they need help with. So basically the thing to do once you educate yourself is figure out what do they need help with. Is it just a matter of spreading the word? Or is it, do they need help fundraising, or do they need help contacting local community leaders and so forth, and asking for help? What else? We did talk about the graphic a little bit. Some strategies would involve more people and more risk or less risk, and so on and so forth. I don't know. That's all I think.
No, that's great. I like that. I like how you emphasize looking at more information and made sure you weren't going to repeat what other organizations may have already done. They could have already figured out some of those issues. So does anyone from the Pitfalls group want to talk about what they discussed?
Larilyn, do you want to, or you want me to? Meredith had to reboot her PC, so she's.
Yeah, I'll let you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay. I guess when we talked about pitfalls, we found that everything seemed to revolve around doing enough research up front so we know not only what we want to achieve, but what those who are perhaps seeking a different solution want to achieve. And you tend to kind of get swept up with the group that you're in and what they all want to have happen, and don't focus on the other. Meredith used the term of ignoring the dog whistles. Really understanding where the money is and who's perhaps trying to focus on a different goal. That could be a huge pitfall. Another is we realized we didn't. For example, Kristen, when you were going through your slides, you talked about the city council and the racing, and you said something about they eliminated cash bail. And as we got into our group, we realized we had no idea what that actually meant. So the point there was make sure you have definitions for everything, that any buzzwords you use, everything you're talking about, that make sure you're speaking clearly and people understand what that is, because there's a pitfall if you kind of gloss over it. Let's see. I think that was it. Larilyn, did I miss anything?
I think you also the emphasis on communications.
Yes. Yeah, you can't over communicate to your group and when you're recruiting other people to join. So those were the major pitfalls we came up with.
Those are all great. I really like those, especially the one about knowing the terminology too, because so many of these issues have so many just different terms that most people have never heard before. Maybe even one of us hasn't heard. So yeah, really important. Someone from the political education and skills group want to talk now?
I will go, and I will admit that I had the fewest ideas contributed to this group. I was more of a note taker than anything else, but I see a lot of overlapping here, so I think that's gonna come up with us too. But we talked about, in terms of education and skills, people needed to know the history of the jail, kind of the current events surrounding it, what's going on with the jail, why is it closing. We want to know about decision makers and influencers, who's for closing the jail, who's for keeping it open, including city council. We want to make sure that folks are trained on how to communicate to the general public. We want to discuss alternatives to police and jail and what happens, make sure everyone kind of knows and is able to talk about what happens to the few people that are currently in the Atlanta City Detention Center. We want to train people how to lobby and message effectively, maybe do a media training on how to get the media's attention, branding, like making sure we're doing a good job of creating a brand. Oh, and yeah, someone, I think maybe it was Rita, someone had an idea of, who else has done this work and how can we learn from them, and sort of teach ourselves how other folks have been successful, and making sure people know how to speak effectively in front of a counselor or in front of the public, and train folks on that, including like groups of people who can go talk to the public or to a counselor. I have a quick dog thing. I will be back in 2 seconds.
No, I think that's great. And I really do like how all the different groups tie together. Like you all kind of considered how to avoid the pitfalls, while also making progress and not rushing in. Because I feel like sometimes, especially, I don't know, if you pick any issue out of the media and it's like sensationalized, it's easy to be like, oh, that's horrible, or that's amazing. And then 3 days later, you have more information and it's really not what it seemed. So it's definitely always good to do your research. That way, when people have questions or when you discover more information, you really know why you're involved in the cause and you're really actually going to make a difference that you want to see. Kyle, did you want to say anything for the community and accountability too? I guess as far as the accountability, my thought was that it's important to check in with the Black-led organizations. Like if everybody's on the same page, it's important to make sure that like you're still supporting them in the way they need to be supported, because if something new comes up, like there's something urgent that they need phone calls for or text banking or, whatever, just to be flexible and willing to listen and remember that they might have a much more personal stake in this than us.
That sounds good to me. I'm glad to make note of the time, which is about 8:45. So I know plenty of folks have gone already. I know we're sort of past that like hour threshold, and yeah, I want to make room for some Q&A. That's what I'm feeling. How's that sound, Kristen?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.